For a while now, racial inequalities and police brutality have been topics of discussion and places of scrutiny. But how do those conversations change when you travel across an ocean, away from the stars and stripes, and into France? The past, presents, and futures of these issues in each country are different, yet the same. France was one of the major colonizers, and while slavery was illegal in French practice, as started by Louis X in 1315, none of the native peoples were free on French colonized ground through the 18th century, and were bound by the Code Noir. The U.S., on the other hand, has a history of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and segregation. All this is to say that both countries have histories which created institutionalized racism, the aftermath of which modern generations are still working to unravel. Like most things in French culture, one must learn about French history in order to understand the cultural phenomenon. France has a history of kings using religion to bolster their political power, which in turn heightened tensions between conflicting religious groups across the country. After generations of internal conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, and then the civil wars of the 16th century, France introduced the idea of laïcité, following the abolition of the monarchy and the founding of the République with the Revolution of 1789. Laïcité is essentially the separation of the church from the state, but it's much more complicated than that. In his book, Why the French Don't Like Headscarves, John Bowen explains that laïcité is reinforced by the French idea of la pensée unique. La pensée unique is a phrase that can be applied in many circumstances, but when applied to the question of French identity, it is the idea that anyone who is French is expected to have the same background, knowledge, and allegiance as all other Frenchmen. This common basis is the means through which the French believe equality, or égalité, can most easily be achieved. So laïcité is not saying that one cannot be religious, but rather that in the public sphere, one must be neutral. More so, they must be French in religious matters. This means that one's allegiance to the culte, or the organization of their religion, cannot take precedence over one's allegiance to the French state. One's religion is considered a private and personal relationship to their God, and therefore it presumably would not enter the public sphere, where it threatens the République une et indivisible that France wills itself to be. Whoa. What does this all have to do with racism in France, though? Remember, I told you that in order to understand anything French, you have to have the historical context. Laïcité rears its head in the modern sphere by bringing about the idea of Islamophobia. I say that from a largely American perspective, as our culture would consider the actions of the French in these regards to be Islamophobic. But remember that the French, legally at least, are only trying to ensure neutrality and unity in the public realm. Bowen's book was written in response to the 2004 law which prohibited the outward expression of one's religious affiliation through one's clothing while in public school. The law, of course, doesn't explicitly target Islamic women, but they are the population most affected by the law. The idea goes back to the égalité of the public space. The French perspective, largely on the Republican side according to Bowen, would say, how could a young Muslim girl ever have the chance of being viewed as equally French as her peers when she has this obvious, potentially divisive religious symbol attached to her? Fundamentally, I think the idea of making everyone equal by separating private life from public life has merit. But the problem, well, do I need to explain why it's wrong to tell a young Islamic girl that she cannot wear her voile to school? I don't think so. Basically, the idea of laïcité is really good at disrupting Islamic representation, but doesn't show the same thoroughness in restricting representation of Catholicism. If you've been to France, you know that it's all about the cathedrals and the exquisite Gothic churches. These historic churches are still funded by various cultural and religious organizations sanctioned by the French state. Some mosques and other religious buildings are also indirectly supported by the state, but at a disproportionate rate to the Catholic counterparts. Even today, Muslim mosques are underfunded and face a lot of difficulty in being built. So Islamophobia is present in France, but how does that relate to racism once again? So another history lesson about French colonialism is in order. For the most part, France colonized predominantly Muslim countries. The former colonies are now independent, but because of their French roots, there has been, and continues to be, large Muslim immigration to France, making Islam the second most practiced religion in France. It's also important to note that French Islamophobia stems from the fear of the extremist groups responsible for the 2015 attacks against the cartoonist Charlie Hebdo. These attacks killed 12 people and sparked nationwide rallies and protests and subsequent attacks from both sides. So France is not saying no. Theoretically, it's not against Islam, it's just that they want a French Islam, free of what they deem extremist forms of influence that could threaten the French Republican values. To compare France once again to the United States, it too is a melting pot of sorts. The US is really less of a melting pot per se, and more of a soup. Everything is all together in one cohesive dish, but when you eat it, you'll get a bit of carrot, potato, onion, etc. All of the ingredients work together to flavor and shape the soup, yet they retain their individuality, both visually and in flavor. In my opinion, the US champions differences, and holds that equality can best be achieved with a diverse group of people. Therefore, like a bite of soup with a piece of potato brings forward its own unique flavor, different from that of a bite with carrot, each diverse voice in a group can bring forth their own opinions shaped by their backgrounds. Par contraste, in France, all of the ingredients are there, but to make it a potage, the whole soup is blended into one smooth, homogeneous dish. When you slurp a spoonful of this soup, it has one taste, each spoonful matching the last. As I explained earlier, this represents the public realm of France. Everyone is expected to bring the same things to the table each time. The only way this could be possible is through a shared knowledge of France, its history, and its politics. But if you concentrate hard enough on that bite of potage, you can taste hints of the individual flavors. A person will have things that makes them unique or different, their race or religion, for example. But these things are reserved for the private sphere. When in public, one is expected to be only French. Because these differences are moved into the private sphere, racial issues are seldom brought up in the public sphere. This made research for this project incredibly challenging because almost every trail I went down came up short. I searched through hashtags. I tried to find local organizations to talk to. I followed every source linked in relevant articles. And eventually, I had to phone a friend to try and figure this out better by learning what she knew as someone who had lived in France her whole life. Ça va?
Est-ce que tu m'entends?
Ouais.
Ok, super.
À ton avis, est-ce que les problèmes de racisme sont plus mauvais en France qu'aux États-Unis?
Franchement, je sais pas. Je pense qu'en France, c'est moins. Ou alors, on va dire que c'est caché. Les gens vont peut-être être racistes, mais ils vont pas l'exprimer, si tu vois ce que je veux dire.
Ouais. Est-ce que les problèmes sont vraiment différents ou est-ce que c'est un résultat des cultures différentes qui permettent plus d'expression?
Si par exemple on fait référence au mouvement Black Lives Matter, et ben en France, il y a eu moins d'importance qu'aux États-Unis. C'est certain. On a eu des manifestations contre le racisme au même moment, mais elles étaient moins importantes que ce qui a pu se passer aux États-Unis, c'est sûr.
France has seen a series of movements calling for the justice of victims of racially motivated police brutality, starting with Justice pour Adama. Like the US, there have been many campaigns like this, but unlike the US, they're not household names. George Floyd is probably a more recognizable name in France than Adama Traoré.
Et si tu me demandais si je connaissais les noms des personnes françaises qui ont été tuées, je pourrais pas te le dire non plus.
Le plus connu, c'est Justice pour Adama.
Oui, Adama Traoré, ouais.
The Black Lives Matter protests from the summer of 2020 indicate how these movements have spread from the US and into France and other countries. But these racial movements aren't the only influence from the US that the France is concerned about. Recently, there has been a growing concern about the influence of the US on French universities. Here, professors and students connected to the internet see that U.S. universities offer courses in LGBTQ+ issues, racial heritage, and other areas of studies that look at marginalized groups of the population. The French view this as a form of communautarisme. Communautarisme, in this sense, is again an example of the French fear that the groups or circumstances that shape one's identity, like race or religion, will overpower one's French identity. And to go back to the soup metaphor, it'd be like if I added 5 more carrots to the French soup. The soup would no longer be just a red soup, it would be a carrot soup, as the more predominant ingredient would trump the other flavors. So what does it all mean? Well, I don't really think one country has it figured out more or less than the other. I think both countries are working towards equality or égalité, and there's just a lot of factors that have yet to be figured out. It's figuring out how to be inclusive without losing the cultural past of your own country. And maybe by looking at how other countries are approaching these issues, we can come to a greater understanding.